All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our panel on the late 20th century. My name is James Goldberg. I'm the president of the Association for Mormon Letters, and this panel is part of a larger AML conference currently happening. You can stay the next hour for readings from our middle grade and young adult and picture book, I believe, finalists. And then we'll have some special panels this weekend and awards on Saturday. Robert Bennett will be moderating tonight's panel, and I'll turn the time over to him.
So let me introduce the panelists for tonight. First, we'll have Kathleen Dalton Woodbury, who is the wife of a retired chemical engineer and the mother of 3 girls and the grandmother of 4 boys and 6 girls. She and her husband served as ordnance workers in the Salt Lake Temple for over 9 years until it was closed for renovation. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics education and a Master of Engineering degree in mechanical engineering, both from the University of Utah. She taught a short story writing course for her local high school community school for many years and has done first reading for a few fiction magazines. She wrote 6 short stories which were published in professional anthologies and which qualified her for membership in the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. She moderated the Hat-Track River Writers Workshop at Orson Scott Card's Science Fiction and Fantasy website from January 1997 until July 2020. She joined the board of the Association for Mormon Letters in February 2001 and became acting president in February 2005 until someone better qualified could take the official position. She had a part-time computer business where she helped people with those scary machines, especially with their genealogy. She is now retired, though she has done some freelance editing this past year. She knits and has tried to learn how to spin her own yarn. She loves cats and collects dragons, unusual names, and information about her ancestors. Then we'll have William Morris, who is the author of Dark Watch and Other Mormon American Stories, and the co-editor of Monsters and Mormons, and editor of States of Deseret. He currently lives in Minneapolis suburbs with his wife and daughter. Mahanrai Stewart is a national award-winning playwright, novelist, screenwriter, poet, theater producer, and educator. His published works include A New Age of Miracles, The Drowned Book, The History of William Shakespeare, Part Last, Farewell to Eden, Manifest, Legends of Sleepy Hollow, Jimmy Stewart Goes to Hollywood, Swallow the Sun, The Early Life of C.S. Lewis, Emperor Wolf, Prometheus Unbound, Evening Eucalyptus and Other Enchanted Plays, A Roof Overhead and Other Plays, The Fading Flower, and Saints on Stage, an anthology of Mormon drama, as the editor and contributor. Stewart is the recipient of the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival's National Playwriting Award, 2nd place, as well as their National Selection Team Fellowship Award, the LDS Film Festival Screenwriting Award, the Hell Center Theater's Ruth and Nathan Hell Comedy Playwriting Award, the AML Award for Breast Drama, and the AML's Lifetime Achievement Award. Nearly 25 of his plays have been produced at various theaters, universities, and festivals throughout the United States and Europe and are available through Leicester Bay Theatricals. He received his Bachelor's of Theater's Arts degree from Utah Valley University and his Master of Fine Arts degree in Dramatic Writing from Arizona State University. And our final panelist, Annette Lyon, apologizes that she could not make it tonight because of family obligations, but Nicole and James Goldberg will be taking her place, and they are the editors of the annual Mormon Lit Blitz and Reasonably Good People. My name is Robert Bennett, and I'll be the moderator, and I'm the professor of English at Montana State University, and I'm currently taking my first steps at writing Mormon fiction. I'm working on a missionary novel titled Elder Lithium, The Misadventures of a Manic Mormon Missionary. I'm new to Mormon literature, though I've been a literature professor for about 20 years now, and just sort of dabbling in it. But as a brief introduction, when I was asked to be the moderator for this, I realized that I had two early formative experiences with late 20th century Mormon literature. The first was as a 14-year-old Mormon boy from Idaho reading Jack Wayland's novel, Charlie, which I was absolutely enthralled with and found it fascinating. Then 10 years after that at BYU as a master's student in English, I went to a reading by Brian Evanson, who was reading his Killing Cats story from Altman's tongue when he was being pressured from the BYU administration and being sort of censored there, which eventually led to his departure from the university. And so I introduced those two experiences just to show you the wide range of different kinds of Mormon literature from this period. And I think we'll have a very interesting discussion with such a wide range of material to draw from. With that, I'll turn the time over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Robert. If you listen to Orson Scott Card speak for very long, you come to realize how much he loves people. Common, simple, hardworking, everyday people. The ones that pride looks down on. Card will tell you that he has no pride. And you can hear the truth of that in his speech and read it in his works. He also has no time or patience for superficiality or excuses. He just has a lot of love. He was born in 24 August 1951 in Richland, Washington. He grew up in Santa Clara, California, Mesa, Arizona, and Orem, Utah. He served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Brazil from 1971 to 1973, and then went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1975 in theater from Brigham Young University. He also earned a Master of Arts degree in English from the University of Utah. He started a repertory theater company in Provo in 1974 while working as an editor at Brigham Young University Press, which job he had until 1976. Then he worked as an assistant editor at the Ensign, a periodical of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from 1976 to 1978. He earned the John Campbell Award for Best New Writer, given at the World Science Fiction Convention in 1978. In 1985, oh dear, I just lost my screen. What I'm reading to you is something I was asked to write for a special edition of Ender's Game. I never did get a copy of the edition, but somebody was asked to find someone and they asked me, and so this is what I wrote about it with his vetting of it. So this is adapted from that. In 1985, Ender's Game won both the Hugo Award for Best Novel, also given at the World Science Fiction Convention, and the Nebula Award for Best Novel, given by the Science Fiction Writers of America. Its sequel, Speaker for the Dead, received the same awards the next year. Card started writing as a playwright for his Bachelor of Arts degree and for his short-lived repertory theater company. When the debts for the company outpaced the income from his editing job, he turned to writing fiction, science fiction, the kinds of stories he grew up loving to read. The fact that he was paid for writing something he loved only encouraged him. Science fiction isn't all that he writes. Besides plays, he has written poetry, reviews, and essays, some of which have been published in a collection about being a Latter-day Saint and a writer, a storyteller in Zion. He has also written two how to write books, Character and Viewpoint, and How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, and several articles on computer gaming. Excuse me. He has written a planetarium star show, Space Pioneers, with the writers at Hansen Planetarium in Salt Lake City, Utah, his contribution being the human element of the story. He did a novelization of James Cameron's movie, The Abyss, chosen by Cameron because of Card's strength in characterization. This effort became more of a collaboration with the movie makers than a mere novelization, due to Cameron's willingness to work with Card and to allow his actors to be influenced in their character development by the backstory Card created for the characters. He was also involved in the screenplay and the production of the movie based on Ender's Game. He published mainstream LDS fiction through his publishing company, Hatrack River Publications, describing it as the kind of fiction that Jane Austen would have written if she'd been in Salt Lake. Other LDS works include a script for America's Witness for Christ, the Hilcamora pageant that was produced in upstate New York, and scripts for several series of religious animated videos and audio plays. He has taught at Clarion and Clarion West annual 6-week summer workshops for science fiction and fantasy writers, at Antioch's Writers Workshop in Ohio, at the University of Utah, at Appalachian State University, at Southern Virginia University, as well as creating and teaching his own literary boot camp for several years. Why did he choose science fiction? He has said of science fiction readers that, quote, they'll take any kind of experiment and treat it with respect, close quote. Science fiction allows him to use ideas more directly. It allows him to put real people in a strange setting and experience it with them. It is the most supple genre for writing moral fiction. It exists to challenge, to be culturally influential. Its strange settings and alien attitudes invite readers to see through others' eyes and to question and clarify their own moral imperatives. Among the influences of his work is the Book of Mormon. Early in the book, a young man accepts a special mission because he knows that a way would be prepared for him to accomplish that mission. The young man finds, however, that the way prepared is difficult beyond expectations, exacting a high price. Card asks no less of his own creations. Card's beliefs affect everything he writes, whether he means them to or not. At first, he tried to control that. Quote, if I catch some Mormon idea, I will cut it out, but unconsciously, I put them in, close quote. In later works, however, he delved deep into his heritage for the stories he has written. He believes in a moral universe, in purpose behind all the loss and suffering. This view of people as capable of greatness colors all of Card's work. His source for his characters is his own experience of human behavior, experience that has taught him to love and hope for people, to believe that they can rise above the trials and tribulations of life. He believes that stories are part of what identifies a community, the things that pass from generation to generation, allowing the community to survive. Card writes about people who are committed members of the community and therefore have a network of relationships that define who they are. If a character is denied his needed community, he insists on creating one for himself, and in either case, he voluntarily suffers for the sake of the community that includes him. I saw this as I just read his most recent publication, Lost and Found. Card's influence has been felt on many writers in his religious community. His example of how religious ideas can be expressed in science fiction has led several others to attempt to follow in his footsteps. And he has shared his writing insights with those of the larger community of science fiction writers and writers-to-be. He is actively involved in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he now lives. But the community that is of the greatest importance to him is his family. They asked me to put a sidebar for this introduction of Orson Scott Card about messianic figures. And this is what I wrote. The purpose of a messianic figure in fiction is to save, rescue, redeem. The theme of the individual on whom rests the fate of the world, the solar system, the galaxy, even the universe, is prominent in science fiction. It appears over and over in Orson Scott Card's works. Not only does the messianic figure have the duty of saving the community from physical danger, but he must also redeem the community spiritually, if necessary. Certainly in Card's books about Ender Wiggin, such spiritual redemption becomes necessary, and Ender takes upon himself the guilt for the mistakes humanity has made in dealing with aliens. He creates the position of speaker for the dead to give people the chance to avoid such mistakes in the future by helping them learn to understand and love what is strange to them. He gives them the opportunity to enlarge their communities, in so doing, enlarge their own souls. The Latter-day Saint view of the Savior is that his resurrection saves all of humanity from physical death, and that his atonement for the sins of those who come unto him redeems them from their deaths in relation to things spiritual. In both ways, he accounts for what would otherwise keep them from fulfilling their potential as children of God. The spiritual rescue is especially important, taking away their guilt and setting them free to rejoin the community of heaven. Thank you. If just a quick list, his Ender series up to Ender's Shadow was written before the turn of the century. Folk of the Fringe, Tales of Elvin Maker, except for the last one that was published. The Homecoming Saga, which is based loosely on the Book of Mormon. The Worthing series, Past Watch, The Redemption of Christopher Columbus. Lovelock, A Planet Called Treason, Songmaster, Heart's Hope. Saints, also known as Woman of Destiny. Worms, Lost Boys, Treasure Box, Stone Tables, Homebody, Enchantment, and then his 2 books on how to write were all written in the late previous century. Any questions?
Okay, we can pass it on over to William.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen here. I have some very small slides. So I'm going to tackle, so Kathleen did Orson Scott Card, who looms large for the for science fiction, and what really sets the table for what happens in the 21st century. James and Nicole are going to tackle some of the more popular fiction. Mahani is going to tackle drama. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on some short story collections and some criticism, because what we're talking about here with the late 20th century really is the 1960s to the 1990s, and it is the advent and heyday of what Eugene England would call faithful realism. That is literature that focuses or that draws upon sort of the modernist realism tradition, but does so in a way that is faithful to, if not approved by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is not completely overtly antagonistic to it, or at least to some of the truth claims that it makes. And this is the era really of LDS bookstores, of fiction and poetry actually being sold by LDS bookstores before consolidation among publishers and booksellers, like the Desert Book Monopoly kind of alters the landscape in the 21st century. And so I'm focusing on short story collections because it's what I'm most familiar with, but it's also, I think, what's most interesting for understanding and defining the field, specifically when we're talking about the more literary stream of Mormon literature. And also, many of the stories published in the 21st century, from my point of view, knowingly or unknowingly, are really oftentimes plowing the same ground. So we really kick off, and again, there are lots of other great stories and story collections that came out. I have just selected a few. I want to start with The Rummage Sale by Donald R. Marshall. That was published in 1972 and really kind of kicked off or opened up the era of like thinking through Mormon fiction as Mormon literary realism. And it has some Lost Generation vibes in the sense that there's a focus on Mormon provincialism in the stories, but it also includes some really interesting modernist fiction techniques. And I would say my personal opinion is the story of the weekend, one of the best stories in the field as a whole, and deserves to be on the top 100 list. Then we get to Doug Thayer's collection, which comes out in 1977. This really is a template for Mormon faithful realism. A lot of the stories in the field come after it, even if they weren't directly influenced by it, are often in the same vein, and especially talking about kind of the post-out-migration era of Mormonism, of you get characters who maybe are coming back to Utah and they live in California, or who are in dialogue with outside the inner Mountain West. I'm going to come back to Bella Petsco. John Benny and Phyllis Barber are worth mentioning. They have come out with collections in the 1990s. They bring in a little bit more humor. Barber especially brings in some more lyricism. They're a little bit more critical, a little bit less faithful in terms of faithful realism, but also kind of part of the vein. There's this real outlier, however, that we get with Bella Petsco and his his collection, Nothing Very, Very Important in Other Stories, which could be called a story collection or it could be called a novel in fragments. It is about a Hungarian-American convert to the church who serves a mission. It is a mission novel, and there's all sorts of mission fiction that comes after this novel, especially in the 1990s and the early 2000s, both in terms of stories and novels, and of course films as well. And but this work is kind of its time, but is also very much an outlier, very much ahead of its time. It uses modernist, even postmodernist techniques. It touches on issues of race and gender and the international church. It uses free and direct discourse. It brings in sort of scriptural passages. It's definitely, to me, in my mind, it definitely has to go on the list, and it's something that I would highly recommend. And if you are looking to, like, if you're a younger writer or a critic and you're looking to kind of innovate, start here. Rereading it for this panel, I was struck by how much of my fiction steals technique from it, although a lot of it is less stealing directly from Petsco and more we're stealing from some of the same modernist and postmodernist writers kind of outside of Mormon literature. And then I don't really have time to touch on this, but I just want to just call out the Salvador by Margaret Young. And it's a very interesting novel, also ahead of its time. It's not actually magic realism like everybody says, but it does very interesting things. Okay. Let's go to the next slide and just really touch quickly on criticism. This is really where most of our criticism comes from. There's some that happens before, of course. There's some that also happens in the 21st century, but there's a lot more that's available that comes specifically in the 1980s and the 1990s. Arts and Inspiration is very interesting. It is a collection that was published by BYU. It is the only collection I know of where you have Boyd K. Packer and Wayne Booth in the same work. It has both sort of theoretical essays, and then it also has a bunch of essays from Mormon artists, including visual artists and performing artists. You can find used copies of it. It's very dated in some ways, but and way more hopeful than I think we would maybe perhaps feel now. But it's also very inspiring and interesting, and honestly, it's due for an update. I think I just want to talk about one more thing, and I'll share these slides in some form so that people can see the list. One thing is I want to mention in kind of revisiting some of this criticism and thinking about the conversations that we've had, and honestly, the conversations that we've had in the first 2 decades of the 21st century are pretty much not that different from what they were having back in the 1990s. But one of the things that struck me most was some of these pieces by Eugene England, where it's not just kind of like these broad discussions about Mormon literature, and it's not just a review focusing on one author or one work. It's doing something in between and actually doing some analysis and some cultural criticism. And I specifically would recommend Danger on the Left, Danger on the Right, The Ethics of Recent Mormon Fiction. I'll stop there and pass the mic back to Robert.
Okay, we'll pass it on to Mahanrai Stewart.
Right. I was really debating where to start. I was wondering if I should go macro or micro, and I decided on micro. In 5 minutes, there's just too much for me to wade through. I was really considering looking at Eric Samuelson's work or Mel Larson's, but I landed on Huebner. In the 1970s, it was a ripe time for Mormon drama, and some beautiful work was being produced during that time that laid the foundation, which a lot of us built on later. And so we owe a great debt to some of those writers in the 70s from BYU. And so I'm going to read a truncated version of some things I said about Huebner in Saints on Stage, which is an anthology of Mormon drama in the introduction to that particular play. I cut it down quite a bit, but I'll go from there. Thomas Rogers graduated from the University of Utah, after which he attended Yale and Stanford, where he received his PhD in Russian literature. He has taught at Howard University, the University of Utah, and Brigham Young University. Rogers has penned several plays. However, it is his play Kushner that has had the strongest impact not only on Mormon drama as a genre, but also on the whole of Mormon literary and social culture. Its theme of conscience versus authority have had ethical repercussions that can still be felt to this day within many Mormon circles. Kushner is about Helmut Huebner, a young Mormon who resists not only Hitler and the Third Reich, but also a Nazi branch president from his own faith. Considered one of the great classics of Mormon drama, it is based on a historical episode that Rogers first encountered while he was serving in his first mission for the LDS Church. Quote, "My first mission was in northern Germany with headquarters in Berlin. Hamburg, Huebner's hometown and the site of his clandestine activity, was one of our cities. I recall a fellow missionary there mentioning Huebner's story, which he had heard from a local member. This was fairly unusual since our members and investigators were rather tight-lipped about their personal experience during World War II, which had ended just a decade earlier. I was only dimly aware that a number of those we worked with then had been members of the Nazi Party. After my mission, I put the whole thing out of my mind. It was almost 2 decades later as I served on the BYU faculty, and my colleague Alan Keel gave a presentation to our college faculty about Huebner's impact on important post-war German officers, notably Nobel Prize winners Heinrich Boel and Gunther Grass. Knowing of my interest in writing plays, Alan singled me out and challenged me to write a play on the subject. Alan and history professor Douglas Tobler were about to publish a book about it, and generously shared with me their research, which became the play's principal source. Until that moment, I'd almost forgotten I'd ever written plays. Rogers wrote Huebner, which premiered in 1976 at the BYU Margetts Theater. It was extended several times, played to capacity audiences, and was viewed by an estimated 5,000 audience members. Revival productions, such as the one BYU produced in 2001, have also sold well and received enthusiastic responses. Margaret Blair Young, who played Huebner's mother in the original production, described the spirit that pervaded the theater after performances. When the play was over each night, there was a lingering reality that I hadn't often felt in the theater department. Huebner's ghost was ubiquitous. Part of this powerful feeling was due to the fact that many LDS members who had immigrated from Germany to America after World War II were in the audience, and many of them had known Helmut Huebner personally. Furthermore, some of the people in the audience were actual people being played by the actors on the stage. Both the real Karl-Heinz Schnibb and Rudy Bob, prominent characters in the play, were in the audience and would personally talk to the actors afterwards. Although Karl-Heinz Schnibb was healthy and handsome when he met the cast, he disclosed that he'd been sent to a Siberian prison camp and had weighed only 98 pounds when the Red Cross rescued him. Rare moments occurred when history and drama were meeting and shaking each other warmly by the hand. With these still living figures whom the actors were portraying in their midst, the production utilized the presence of these freedom fighters to create a dramatic scenario that emphasized just how close to the truth this play was coming. For both the premiere and performance and the anniversary of Helmut's execution about a month later, we had intentionally rigged what proved to be an extremely dramatic postscript. And this is Margaret Blair Young talking here, by the way. After initial applause, a line of 3 equally placed spotlights again lit the stage. In the first stood the real Karl-Heinz Schnibb, and the third, the real Rudy Bob, Huebner's 2 principal teenage LDS co-conspirators. The middle spot remained empty, commemorating Huebner's own unavoidable absence. The effect was to bring events portrayed through artistic representation vividly into the audience's awareness, almost into their laps in the tiny Margetts Arena Theater. The effect was stunning, and word quickly spread, unquote. This spiritual and emotional feast didn't deter controversy from rearing its inevitable head. Leaders of the church in Salt Lake City raised some concerns as to how the play would affect the progress being made behind Iron Curtain countries and other communist strongholds because of its representation of a Latter-day Saint opposing an oppressive government. However, BYU President Dalton H. Oaks, who would later become an LDS apostle and member of the First Presidency, commended the play to a patron of the university. He called the play excellent and insisted it dealt with a subject that tugs at our hearts and reminds us of the complexities of the life we live, unquote. At first, however, Rogers was unaware of the storm stirring on higher levels about his play. He wasn't attempting to be a firebrand. and hadn't even worried about that the play might be seen as controversial. Quote, all along I presumed that the play would receive a positive reception, which for the most part it in fact did. My bishop was in fact the one of its most enthusiastic viewers. There was no sense in those halcyon days that in our explorations, we were at all dissident, unquote. Despite the best and most faithful of intentions, church leaders requested that the play not be performed again. Judging the many concerns that press upon leadership of a worldwide missionary-oriented church, there were concerns about a play that dealt with the issues that were still so potently in effect in the wider world. This is a quote from Rogers. Our then university president, Dalton Oaks, conveyed the request. It had become from members of the board of trustees responsible for church affairs in Europe, including East Germany, which was still under Russian occupation. We also had a number of members in Allende's Chile, which was at that point a socialist nation. It seemed possible, if unlikely, that one or more well-intended members of those societies might be inclined, if it came to their attention, to emulate Huebner vis-a-vis their own regimes, with dire consequences for the church. I and others have speculated about other possible reasons. Suffice it to say, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, a BYU main stage revival of the play proceeded without any official complaint or censure, as have other productions of the play since then. Helmuth Huebner in real life was excommunicated by his branch president, only to have his membership reinstated by the highest leaders of the church when the injustice came to their attention. The same seems to occur to Huebner as a character within Rogers's play. He too was first silenced, then celebrated.
Okay, now we'll pass it on to Nicole and James.
You want me to
All
start?
right. Yeah, start. Go for it.
All right. Well, been preparing for this for a few hours now. This is a last minute shift. So one of the things that James told me wasn't really being taught on was the popular Mormon market of the late 20th century. And as I was talking with him about it, he was like, do you just want to come and do this? So the thing that the experience I had was not only growing up as a Latter-day Saint, but I also worked at Deseret Book in this same era back in the day. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Mormon market. And one of the things I think that's really interesting is sort of the response of the Deseret Book complex that everybody struggles with, and I've had people say things to me before about it because of the the feeling that it's not open enough to different literary interpretations. I do think that a lot of this stuff that came out in this area through the Mormon market was a response. We like to watch old movies with our kids, different eras, and go through things. And we recently watched Tom Hanks' Big. You guys know that movie? That great scene in FAO Schwartz where he's like jumping on the piano. It's this great scene and it's this family movie. But there is also a scene where like this kid who suddenly became 13 years old, this 13-year-old kid who suddenly became 30, hooks up with a grown woman. And my kids were flipping out, right? And I said to James, I said, gosh, I forgot about all the weird sex things in 80s movies. And they had this. And I think that was that's one of those trends where there's a lot more cursing, a lot more sex, entertainment and novels, movies, TV shifted pretty drastically in the 70s and 80s. Even things that are family films have stuff that more conservative members of the church feel uncomfortable about. And that's where the Mormon market comes in and really explodes. We already had some, Robert talked about his experience with Charlie, and Charlie is published in 1980 after the short story appeared in The New Era. But the novel itself is published in 1980. And this is kind of a move from the church magazines and those kinds of short stories and those different things into the novel. And we end up getting a lot of stuff at an AML conference about 6 years ago. I asked in a panel, I asked the audience, I said, what was your first interaction with Mormon literature? And almost everybody was saying Jack Wayland, Tennis Shoes Among the Nephites, The Work and the Glory, all of these popular Mormon market books. And I think that we want to allow space for that because there was a space for that. The fact that as a church, we have like an official church sponsored publication, like publishing house that is successful is a pretty big deal. And I don't want to say you have to love Charlie, but you should. Or that you have to read all 14 Tennis Shoes Among the Nephites books. But it really, Tennis Shoes Among the Nephites really fulfilled this niche and gave this opportunity for kids in the late 80s and the 90s to be able to read this, magical, fantastical world of time travel in the world of the Book of Mormon, and parents knew it would be clean. And I think that's the thing that we really want to see, that's what happened with the Mormon market, is you could trust it a little bit more. You could read Anita Stansfield and not worry about like what the heck just happened in this romance and those kinds of things.
And I think it's particularly interesting. It's particularly significant that we mark some of that era because it appears to be sort of ebbing away again, that to the extent that as media is diversified, there may be less of a drive for Mormons to have a specifically Mormon media. And to the extent that there is, Deseret Book has moved into a lot of crossover stuff, like the proper Regency romance. And so as we move forward, we may find it interesting to look back at this moment where there was a specific flowering.
Yeah.
I do want to say I didn't read any of these books as a kid. I asked my mom later about it, and she said, "Yeah, all the books she read as a kid were from the library. I never bought you books at the time, so you didn't get any Mormon literature growing up." I read Charlie fairly recently, and as a historian, it was fascinating to look at how it captured some of the themes of discourse in the church at the time. And so as objects of literary study, in addition to like the reading value for an individual, a lot of these Mormon market books do a good job at capturing a moment. Okay, I wanted to talk very quickly about a few other things. William mentioned some of the more literary writing. The proliferation of universities and university creative writing programs made it possible for a lot more literary writing to get done. So you have some Mormon poets like Leslie Norris and Clifton Jolly who are at universities. One of the other major Mormon poets from the era, Carolyn Pearson, is not ever employed to my knowledge at a university, but the campus was a place where she would go door to door and sell books, right? And that helped create some of her audience. The Levi Peterson was a professor outside of BYU. He was at Utah State. And his novel, The Backslider, which we've got a separate video where Eric Jepson shares his perspective on The Backslider, is considered one of the Mormon classic novels. It's sort of an interesting mix of a great Mormon novel and a great Utah novel, trying to do both at once in interesting ways. Eugene England raised some concerns where he felt like it didn't adequately capture some Mormon theology, in some ways maybe created a caricature of Mormonism in some elements. So there's an interesting dialogue around that. Very quickly, I wanted to close with an acknowledgement that the late 20th century also marks a point where you start seeing a few writers who are outside of the church and culture discovering Mormon imagery and repurposing it to totally different ends. So Tony Kushner's Angels in America is the most prominent example of this, where there's maybe problems with the text as a representation of Mormonism or a discourse about Mormonism, but that's not the point, right? he was interested in talking about his sense of American stagnation, or kind of a Reagan conservative period of retrenchment, and found that Mormon imagery of angels and restoration and those things, but in this sort of strange inverted way, was useful to him. And so I do think, as we think about Mormon literature, we also want to recognize works like Angels in America that should spur us on to experimentation and thinking about the different ways that our imagery could be used, and a latent potential in it to have different conversations than we've traditionally had. And that wraps it up for me.
All right, well, thank you all for your presentations. And to maybe get us started, I want to tie together these presentations and ask a question about the boundaries of Mormonism and Mormon literature in this period. On the one hand, we have William talking about faithful realism and Nicole talking about the Mormon market, these books that are a little bit more grounded in a traditional understanding of Mormonism. And then on the other hand, we have works like Kushner or Brian Evanson's work, which is really challenging in looking at, or even Tony Kushner looking at some of the darker sides of Mormonism, works that are controversial and sort of outside or beyond the pale of traditional Mormonism. And so I just wanted to ask you what you think about this period, about that tension between the kind of conservative traditional Mormon representations and maybe more challenging unconventional approaches to Mormon literature.
Can I go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't go into depth about this, the Mormon Literaturstreit that happens in the early 1990s. Streit is a word that gets added in German to sort of academic debates about things and sort of policing boundaries of various academic disciplines. And so we had these various presidential addresses and papers that were presented in the context of the AML in the early 90s that go back and forth. And I won't rehearse the whole thing, but one point I want to say is especially if we're talking about faithful realism and sort of Eugene England's, say, critiquing of the backslider, we're really talking about a spectrum here. Yes, Angels of America and Altman's Tongue might be towards one end of that spectrum, but certainly there's plenty of darkness in John Bennion and Bella Petsco, and there's plenty of other stories that are happening there. And so there is, at least on the literary side of things, it is not quite like this oppositional thing. That might happen at an institutional level and an audience level, but if we're talking about the works themselves, there's this big, fairly wide band of works that explore the kind of the complexities of Mormon life and the interactions that Mormons have with each other and their history and with the institutional church. So that would be one point that I make. The other point is that
Quickly, William, before you move
go ahead.
on, I want to say even some of what we would think of as the super conventional Mormon market stuff is often working at some level in that tension, right? Charlie has a lot to do about critiquing traditional culture. A lot of Anita Stansfield stuff are like problem stories, working through different issues.
Work in the Glory too tackles polygamy pretty head on. And I think Gerald Lund doesn't get enough credit for actually some of the complexity in those novels.
And also some of the humor, there's this in the 1990s, there's this burst of Mormon humor that happens. And that through the use of humor also kind of navigates that same thing and really in relation to kind of the correlated church and the demands of the correlated church. So it's a fascinating period for me, because we've gotten maybe a little bit more divided and a little bit weirder and a little bit darker, and that's all great, because that's this is what I'm doing and what I'm interested in terms of Mormon culture in the 21st century. But there's a lot that we can learn, I think, from how the various works from all across the spectrum that we've been talking about negotiated the whole notion of sort of Mormonism and the LDS Church and the Mormon experience So, throughout, especially starting in the 1970s, but especially in the 1990s, the work that came out then.
Yeah, so we see it as much more of a continuum than a polarity. And I think the Black Slider is a great example of that, a classic work of Mormon fiction that has a lot of condoms in it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there are some of those like signifiers, right, that separate. And so everybody's on this continuum of wrestling with issues, but there are really clear markers in that period of whether you're going to be appealing to a perceived really wide Mormon audience or whether you're separating yourself out a little bit, right? So even if multiple novels are wrestling with similar questions, if you throw in a few condoms, that says something rhetorically as well as artistically about how a writer wants to position themselves.
And then there's science fiction and Orson Scott Card with talking about hard things and exploring ways to think in such a sneaky way, because it's science fiction, that most people are blindsided when they realize that he's a Mormon, as far as that goes, and it's there. He tackled some of these things in those years from I'm trying to think. Sneaky, I guess he used science fiction to explore these things without blatantly messing with people's minds in a way that things like Backslider or Hubner would, because it wasn't taken seriously as an outright attempt to be controversial per se. And then he wrote the Homecoming series, and people were accusing him of plagiarizing the Book of Mormon, which means they didn't know what that word means.
And I keep thinking of Eric Samuelson, and in the 90s, well, into the 2000s, obviously too. That's when I was introduced to a lot of his plays, Seating of Senator Smoot, Gaddy Anton, Family, and he always wrote from a place of faith, but also where skepticism or questioning wasn't a dirty word for him either, and so Thomas Rogers talks about in some of his quotes, he thought he was writing from a place of faith. He was never under the impression that he was this firebrand. And I look at somebody like Eric Samuelson or even Mel Larson with Happy Little Secrets, Little Happy Secrets. I know she has a preference on what the order is. I can't remember. But where those were written from a place of great faith, but a very untraditional faith. And so sometimes I think in Mormon culture, there's a pushback when Mormonism presented as their kind of Mormonism. And when somebody it still has great faith in certain Mormon aspects, like Eric Samuelson, but he's writing from a very different point of view, it's jarring for some people, and they immediately assume he's dissident. And so that's always troubled me and fascinated me at the same time.
And
Let me ask a slightly broader question. If we look at some of the works that have been most critically acclaimed, like Tony Kushner's Angels in America, or works that have been most popular, like the Book of Mormon musical, there's a sense in which the world at large seems to want voices that come from outside Mormonism that give us an almost caricature of Mormonism rather than works that are more faithful realism. And I wonder what might be the reason why the broader public is maybe more interested in these more scandalous views of Mormonism than ones that are maybe a little bit more realistic.
Here's what I would say. I would say that although those works you can do interesting Mormon readings of them, I think they're more ventriloquism. And I think that's more those authors are using Mormons because it gives you a kind of a sharper hook to use to explore issues of race and gender and sexuality and really the kind of the dark history of the United States. And so that's how to me, read those more. And so what they're tapping into is, yes, there's a certain amount of interest in Mormonism that they're tapping into, but really what they're tapping into is kind of the ongoing dark history of the country we live in.
You know, it occurs to me listening to William that it's telling that like Mormon writers are not that interested in America, right? Like that's a lot of the literary conversation in the United States is about America. What's America like as a society and country, and how do we move forward?
Well, that's been the project of American literature
yes,
since the 19th century. So,
yes.
Yeah. Late 18th, really.
And maybe one reason that Mormon writers haven't done as well is because we tend to talk about Mormonism with each other or about different life issues rather than what's the project of America. Like, I just can't think of tons of examples where we're effectively commenting on that.
We left America as much as we could, you know, I mean, and we're still kind of in that mindset. I mean, they drove us out.
And maybe that's why sci-fi is such a draw, right?
Well,
except the old country.
Yeah.
When Orson Scott Card first started publishing, the science fiction community, for a lot of them, were extremely nasty to him. He took an awful lot of flack. I have a friend who told me about this. She said, the rest of you, when you started coming on the scene with science fiction, you didn't experience it because he got it all and he stood up to it, and they broke themselves against him. So he was a pioneer in science fiction as a Mormon writer, and they really let him have it for that. So when Dave Wolverton and Shane Bell and Brandon Sanderson and Brandon Mull and all these other started coming into the science fiction field, they didn't run into any of that. I didn't see it. Somebody had to tell me about it because he took it all.
I still got a lot of it in the theater world, you know.
Yeah.
Even with my strained relationship with the church right now, it's I got a lot of flack for being a Mormon playwright, and that was something a real prejudice I ran into again and again.
So
maybe the question we should look at here is to what degree can we bring together an authentic exploration of Mormonism with a real engagement with America and the world at large? Things like the global church. Does a new generation of writers need to find a way to bridge this gap so that Mormonism doesn't become something parochial and ghettoized off in its own isolated corner?
And I think the comment that somebody just made in the comments, y'all, some of us were never in America. That's where I feel the future of, oh, sorry, it went down. We're never in America. That's where I feel the future of the Mold It movement lies, outside America. Because even if it wants to be a global faith, it really needs to tap into those global voices. So.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely some potential going forward. If we're telling, because Mormonism is this transnational culture, I think there's some potential in exploring that, right? what is it like to have a culture that transcends some of these boundaries that people have based their mentality through the 20th century off? And maybe if we work on that stuff now, I don't know that people are as interested now in that conversation, but I think that's something that by the late 21st century, who knows, right? Maybe somebody would look back and recognize and say, okay, these are people wrestling with a new way of making community and meaning.
And I just want to add that all of my work is indirectly critiquing and in correspondence with the United States and the broader American culture. It's just I'm kind of subtle about it. But it's all there. It's looking both ways. It's kind of, I'm always pointing the gun in both directions, to be honest.
It's
Yeah,
like
and to some degree, the backslider did that, though it's engaging Western America, which itself is kind of a marginalized genre.
oh yeah.
All right.
Well, I think we're running out of time now and need to move on for the reading. Gives a quick break here before the reading starts. But I want to thank all of you who came, and especially those who participated on the panel for all of your insights. I think we had an engaging conversation.
Right. Yep.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Robert.
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, if anybody wants to stay tuned in, we'll have readings up shortly. Thanks so much.